Good morning, everyone. Welcome to semifinals B of debate. Today, our debaters will argue the following proposition. The House believes that, in a just society, significantly curtailing economic liberties is an acceptable cost to significantly reduce poverty. Once the debate has begun, you are only allowed to leave the room during the 1 minute allowed between speakers. Please turn off any phones, beepers, pagers, and watch alarms now. Do not applaud until the debate is completely finished. It will take about 1 hour. Thank you.
Hello.
We stand to defend the improvement of the quality of life of people who are currently impoverished. What side opposition would lead you to believe is that it is okay to perpetuate their cycle of poverty in the name of capitalism? What we as the proposition are here to present to you is our case as such. Our baseline argument is that society claims to be just, and they must have checks and balances on power, especially that of the corporate sector. Our definitions are as such. We define significantly curtailing as imposing stringent labor laws to ensure checks and balances. Under this, I'll list out six examples of this. Firstly, we aim to protect employees. Secondly, we stand for a moratorium or a ban on mergers and acquisitions. Thirdly, we ensure checks on balances on legal influences or liberties on companies. Fourthly, we employ harsh penalties on violators of these principles. No, thank you. Fifth, we would like to incur a minimum bank reserve. Sixth, we support welfare. Under my first point of our policy, which is to protect employees, under this we aim for healthcare, insurance, minimum wage, and labor laws. And under the labor laws, we would like to emphasize that individuals must have a maximum amount of hours that they can work per week such that they're not overworked in the conditions that they're placed in. Next, they must be able to enjoy paid leave such as that of maternity leave, etc. Under my second point of my policy, which is a ban on mergers and acquisitions, this will later be covered more in depth by my next speaker. Thirdly, we employ checks and balances on legal liberties of countries. For example, we would like to strengthen current antitrust laws that are already present within the USA, but we do feel that they're still not as ineffective as we would like. Nextly, we would like to strengthen the power of unions because we believe that the strength of the people is quite crucial in order to combating poverty as such. No, thank you, after I go over my policy. Next, we would like to incur harsh penalties on tax avoidance because currently these big companies are not spending their money within the economy during the trickle-down effect, which opposition would like you to believe. This trickle-down effect is not possible because most often the wealth employed by the upper echelons of society just go into offshore accounts, are not spent on the regional economy itself, and so we do not see the fringe benefits of the trickle-down effect anyway. So tax avoidance penalties will be incurred. Fourthly, we will, as aforementioned, have harsh penalties on violators of these principles. For example, during the housing bubble of 2008, post this, we did employ a $282 billion penalty on BNP Paribas because they were one of the main actors in this massive economic meltdown that affected millions of people, and so they must be held accountable for their actions under this. Fifthly, under this, part of the reason why the housing bubble of 2008 and economic meltdown happened was because that banks didn't have a minimum reserve. So we wish to employ checks and balances in order to prevent this, and under this we would have a minimum bank reserve such that banks will not employ the regular high-risk policy in which they would introduce this to other people to entice them to have loans that they're not able to pay, and therefore society would be more likely to be in the cycle of debt. Fifthly, we support welfare in the same way that we do celebrate the economies of Scandinavia and Canada, and we do fight for a more socialist economy such that poverty is less likely to occur. Yes?
Why do the rich have an inherent duty to help the poor?
The rich do not have an inherent duty to fight the poor because under this, the rich are most often owners of these big conglomerate companies, and companies themselves are self-serving, and their only aim is for monetary gains, and so they do not have a responsibility to help the people. It is the government that has a responsibility to help the people. So under my baseline argument, such that society that claims to be just must have checks and balances on power, especially that of the corporate sector, I would like to draw a parallel to governments themselves, because there are checks and balances within governments. And they, in the same way that we do not condone single-party authoritarian regimes, we wish to prevent the manipulation of people on a massive scale. And so the power of the government is likened to the power of companies, except that currently companies are not held to the same standards of controlling this power as governments are. And so we must control this unrestrained control that companies most often have. So let me go on to my first contention and more of a characterization of today's debate, which is how economic liberties perpetuate poverty, and that society injustices as a whole harm the entirety of society. The harms of poverty as a result of free-rein capitalism. So under my first point, I'd like to talk about the developed world, because we believe that this debate is not solely present within the developing world. For example, companies like Walmart are unable to stand towards regular labor laws. For example, they fire people as and when they believe is strategic in terms of the economy, and as a result of this, you have masses of people who are vulnerable to unemployment and are vulnerable to economic situations that they do not have control over. Secondly, we believe that they also do not provide adequate health and safety insurances and minimum wage for their people. And so, more often than not, you have adults who are trying to sustain their families and they cannot do so when they have pittance for income. Secondly, in the developing world, you have massive countries such as Nike, such as GlaxoSmithKline, that do not adhere to their own labor laws within their country, and so within the USA, they do have more stringent laws than, say, the developing world, and so they skirt around this by employing child workers in China, in Afghanistan, and in Vietnam, and so they do this by avoiding their own laws within their domestic country. No, thank you. My third point under the harms of this is mergers and acquisitions. Under mergers and acquisitions, you see the rise of big shark companies eating the smaller minnows. In this, I give you the example of Facebook. Facebook is the owner of a bunch of other fringe companies. For example, Zynga. Zynga is a gaming company, and under this, they have each of their individual games. Facebook is the sole owner of this, and as a result, you see that Facebook and Google have become huge hegemonies that have a huge amount of power and purchasing power of all these smaller businesses. And so under this, you see a less likely to see the rise of smaller companies succeed amongst themselves, and a higher risk of having big companies consume them and have massive controlling power. Lastly, you see banks have a large risk appetite, and because of this, they're more likely to entice owners to buy into this and loan from their banks. But when you see economic collapses and people are unable to pay back these loans, you see a massive cycle of debt, and this relates to poverty. And this is also why millions were impoverished within the 2008 housing bubble. Fifthly, you have abhorrent legal liberties, like that I already ensured to you would be protected under our policy today. Because companies are not held accountable to the same standards of government, we urge you to combat this, and a few preemptive battles for what I believe the opposition will bring out today. They will fight for the trickle-down effect, but what we say is that these fringe benefits will not even occur because these companies are more likely to hold the upper echelons of society and ship them off to offshore accounts. We also see this in Malaysia, where we see these corrupt officials and these corrupt leaders not even bringing the money back to their own country because they're afraid of the consequences there. And so they're more likely to send this money off to London, to send this money off to overseas accounts that are not going to see the benefits of the people that matter. And to this, I'm proud to propose. Thank you.
let's be very clear about what we're talking about in today's debate. Yes, we are talking about curtailing economic liberties, but we are also talking about reducing poverty. What we are really addressing in today's debate is the trade-off between the two. The cases in which there's an inverse proportionality, in which having unregulated business perpetuates poverty or more inequality in society. And what we've seen, the arguments in side proposition, is simply them railing on unregulated capitalism without making any reference to the trade-off that is inherent in this motion that we are talking about today. So now, before going further into rebuttals on their points, let me first set up the yardstick for the House today and clarify some of the definitions that we found lacking from their side. We would define economic liberty as the ability of companies and people to determine how to spend their income and profits. So what we're talking about in the context of this motion in terms of not curtailing these is the freedom for these companies and individuals from excessive taxes or government regulations or controls on businesses. So examples of that on our side's paradigm, where we maintain these economic liberties, are places like Singapore, where we have a maximum tax rate of less than 20%, countries like Hong Kong that have similar capitalist societies. And on their side of the house, when they're talking about curtailing it, they are talking about places like Scandinavia that do, in fact, restrict these liberties in the goal of redistributing wealth. We define poverty as insufficient money to access accepted living standards in a country, and we would like to emphasize that this is relative, that the standards in different societies are different, that in Sierra Leone, poverty might mean something very different than it does in Sweden. And here we would like to address the point that they have made, that they are limiting this debate to the developed world. We do not see this as fair because we see that the developing world comprises 70% of the world and is a very major point that we as side opposition would like to address. We say that in the developing world in particular, it is very important to maintain less regulation because economic growth for these countries that are still in the nascent forms of their development is very critical and more important than the goal of redistributing wealth. But since their side has chosen to restrict the debate, we will go with their side for the purpose of clash as our burden as opposition. Now, when we were talking about this debate, they have gone to some very concrete examples, but we'd like to say that since this motion says a just society, we are not talking about how different countries will be implementing these measures, how they will be implementing these standards. That would be a debate more about the transition phase. What we're really talking about is, if we were to build a society up from the ground level, which principles, which society would we build? Would we build a society like Singapore or a society like Scandinavia if we have the ability to implement either of those? No, thank you. So our policy, what we would like to see as the model for development of this just society that we are creating, is a place with low taxes, with no minimum wage, with no national health care, with no unemployment benefits, a place where taxes and government revenue is used to equalize opportunity rather than equalize outcome. Now, since we are debating this in the context of a post-Enlightenment world, we're not going to be advocating complete laissez-faire, as we believe that that is not something that has any real place or any real context in this thought. No, thank you. We are talking about very minimal taxes, and those taxes that are collected will be used for school and job training programs focused on opportunity and mobility. So such as an example of Singapore with a high Gini coefficient, high economic inequality, but top-class schools that are affordable for everybody in the country. So any person, even persons who are mentally disabled, who are low-skilled, can have the opportunity to rise up. And our yardstick for this debate is on fairness and meritocracy, on equality of opportunity as opposed to redistribution of wealth. And we have more substantive for the House. Firstly, curtailing economic liberty is unmeritocratic. Secondly, the rich are not accountable to the foreign society. Thirdly, how curtailing liberty disincentivizes growth. And fourthly, about how this policy does not achieve the root cause. So let me go into some brief rebuttals. They brought up this whole idea that we need to regulate companies because they have a monetary incentive so they don't care about their workers. Firstly, this is not true. Many companies realize that paying their workers a meaningful wage is actually important to their success because these workers will then have a better incentive to work, such as examples like Costco, where they pay their workers more than the minimum wage because they care about having motivated workers. And even if this was true, we see that this monetary incentive is a good thing for society because profits of a company reflect the value they provide to society, and this is why we do not want regulations, because we see that private organizations, as opposed to government ones, maximize the value at the most efficient cost to society. And even worse, if we go on their side's paradigm, no thank you. We say that we are going to get rid of any of these benefits because these companies are going to be offshoring and going overseas. And this leads me to the next rebuttal on their point about sweatshops. where we say that, first of all, sweatshops are beyond the scope of this debate since they have limited it to developed countries. But even if we are talking about sweatshops, these sweatshops will get worse under their paradigm, where they where they want to make such harsh regulations that these countries will be forced offshore. The point about mergers and acquisitions we will not be debating because of the fact that it does not fall into the trade-off that this motion implies, since there's no cost to relative poverty in it. So let me move on to my first point about how curtailing economic liberties is unmeritocratic. And the thesis for this point is that arbitrary...
PY, sir?
Yes?
You do realize that liberty companies like to have is being able to choose how much they pay their workers and how they will treat their workers. When we impose a minimum wage, isn't that a curtailing of liberty, which according to you sounds just? How do you feel then about this curtailing of liberty?
No, because we believe that one of the flaws in a minimum wage is equalizing this sort of balance, that everybody below a certain level gets equalized to the same playing field, which I will be rebutting more in this point. So when we say that we level the playing field and the goal of equality is unfair because we are essentially raising the floor but also lowering the ceiling. And why is this? Because in a society where we are lowering inequality, the kind of taxes we have imposed are those that are going to be more stringent on the top, where the top is going to be redistributed to the bottom. And why raising the floor is bad is because it equates everyone below the bench line to a certain standard. So we're essentially saying that the custodian whose value to the company, to a school is perhaps $7 an hour, is equated to a person on a typewriter who's simply pressing a certain key over and over, whose value to society may be $2 per hour. And we do not see it as fair to level everyone to this bench line standard when their values to society are inherently different. And why lowering the ceiling is bad is because in the same way that we want to reward proportionally those at the bottom, we want to reward those at the top proportional to their work. Doctors and engineers should be rewarded proportionally to their value of their work, and they should not have these extra heavy on the top 90% taxes or 80% taxes that these socialist states want to impose on those on the top. And this ties back to our yardstick of fairness and on not putting unfair and undue burden on these people. My next point is on the accountability of the rich to the poor. And the thesis of this substantive is that because political boundaries that bind taxpayers are arbitrary, the rich should not be forced legally to redistribute their wealth. Now let's look at how the tax system works, especially in the context of welfare and healthcare, the kind of things that their side would want to be working on. This implies a certain accountability of redistributing wealth from the rich to the poor, which in the context of the nation state doesn't apply, because people didn't get to determine the boundaries of the state. They didn't get to decide that the person working in Massachusetts is accountable to the success of the person living in Texas. Why is that person in Massachusetts more accountable to the poor person in Texas than to somebody in Congo? We said that on a legal basis, since they have not defined these boundaries, they are not legally accountable to either. They should be morally accountable, yes, but should we be forcing these boundaries on people who had no decision and no way to form the sort of nation states that their tax system provides? We say absolutely not. In our side, these rich people will be accountable to the institutions that help raise them up. We talk about how we're focusing on schools and job training programs, these kind of things that help the rich and the poor both, and the rich should be accountable to those because these are the institutions that help them up and the ones that they form part of their identity, rather than the poor people and the part of their nation state that they have no firm allegiance to. And this ties back to fairness because legal responsibility should be in accordance with fairness and principles of accountability, which we say falls on our side of the house. Thank you.
Mic test. Members of this august house, it is a pleasure to speak before you today. But while I do, I recognize that there are large numbers of people all around the world who live in abject poverty and deplorable conditions, even within booming economies like the United States. Hey, take a look at Detroit. But what's worse than this is that big companies are often given lots of liberties and free rein to trample all over these people and perpetuate the same kind of poverty and injustice that they've been perpetuating now for generations. We are happy to hurt these companies if it means helping people and reaching the goal of reducing poverty, given two things. Given one, that these companies themselves have already been hurting people for generations because like they say, they aren't accountable to any other system but the ones that brought them to power. And two, the wealth that these companies generate always stays locked in the upper echelons of society and never go back to the people anyway because of things like offshoring. That's why our baseline reads, a just society must always place checks and balances on power, especially that of the corporate sector. And to this respect, I have three arguments that I want to make. One, how economic liberties can perpetuate poverty, and I'll recharacterize what Sonia already told you. Second, how economic liberties perpetuate subtle injustices in society, even in the best regulated capitalist societies. And finally, I want to answer the question, which side gets a better economy and better produce for the people? Lots of work to do today, so let's get into the first argument about how you perpetuate poverty. Because a lot of economic liberty gives power to businesses that didn't need that power in the first place. Because businesses are so rich and have huge access to media and influence, we don't know why team opposition would want government to throw in their weight with the winning, disproportionately advantaged side. Why have pro-business policies, especially when pro-business policies allow for big companies like Walmart to lay off workers as they choose? America has regulations on health and, no thank you, health, security, and safety insurance, but because Walmart, for example, wields tremendous political influence, they lobby for political leaders and party members that allow them to skirt around these health and insurance policies and not guarantee their workers what they should be guaranteeing their workers. And that's for lots of people get employed and paid less than they are worth, even in states like the United States, which is perfectly regulated. We want to increase those regulations and make Walmart more credible, but that's the best case for you. The worst case is that even if you have some good companies, for every one good company, you have 10 other companies out there that are willing to perpetuate exploitations of the worst kind. Nike has had a horrible history of exploiting, no thank you, child labor in China. These are things that people seldom hear about. GlaxoSmithKline, a drug testing company, has been caught numerous times testing drugs in early stages on the third world countries of Indonesia and the Philippines. They're happy to sell these drugs to the people because there are no stringent labor laws and penalties that hold them accountable for those actions. If you are going to stand there, no thank you, and defend regulation, we think you're playing into the government side of the house. Because we then, if you think companies should be morally accountable, then we say yes, express that by making them legally accountable too. That's why we're happy to stand for even harsher labor laws if that might mean hurting the companies, given that it can help the people. We are very upset that you didn't want to engage with mergers and acquisitions, because we worked really hard on that argument. We're proud of it. Mergers and acquisitions are one of the subtle ways that companies can perpetuate injustice even within the best regulated societies. Big mammoth conglomerate companies like Google and Facebook can happily eat up smaller, independent app developers and send them into poverty. The inventor of Candy Crush, that app meant a lot for him, and that app was his livelihood. But when big companies like Google can use patent laws and use lots of money to just buy these apps away from the people, that's horrible, no thank you. And we think moratoriums on mergers and acquisitions break companies up and give them back to the people. And that's good, because we don't like corporate hegemony and we don't like big companies getting bigger at the expense of smaller ones. Finally, tax avoidance isn't a crime. It should be, because we're not okay with big companies offshoring all the money they make in Bahamian tax shelters, because they make a lot of money, and if you cannot tax that money will never go back to the people. No thank you. These are the injustices that exist within the guise of economic liberty, even in the best regulated capitalist societies. That's why we say it perpetuates poverty and harms people. But let me tell you about more injustice. But before I do, I'm happy to take a POI. No? Alright, fine. Let's talk about legal influence that these companies have. It's very hard to bring big companies to court in the first place. A good example will be Uber, because recently someone was attacked by, when people get attacked by the drivers that Uber employs, it's very hard to sue Uber and make Uber responsible for that harm, because there are always fine print and clauses that protect these companies from such harms. It's very difficult to bring companies to court. That's an injustice. But even if you do manage to bring them to court, no thank you, the economic liberties, you had your chance, the economic liberties that they have in court make it difficult for us to hold them accountable for things they do. For example, owners are often tried separately from their companies, making them invincible and likely to go on propagating the harm they have harmed. Companies also have significant media influences to tell people they didn't do the things they did and cover up their excesses and their injustices. Finally, your economic liberty allows for wealthy companies to have access to better lawyers, buy off NGOs and evidences, and things like that. All of these means companies are practically impregnable in the legal sphere. You say they should be morally accountable, but not legally accountable to any institution. We say they should be legally accountable to every institution, especially the state and the people. Yes, sir.
If
you're saying that under the current status quo, companies are unaccountable. How do we have instances where JP Morgan is being sued for $20 billion?
Right, and and that's a great success under our side of regulation. We think too many companies, JP Morgan is charged, but lots of banks get away with things that they do, and we want more banks to be held accountable. That's why we think imposing government lawyers, closed courtrooms, all of these are important checks and balances to make companies more accountable. Finally, on political influence, because even in well-regulated societies, big companies are corporate non-person entities that don't represent the people, but oftentimes have huge influence on campaign outcomes, which we think is undemocratic. Few examples are like super PACs in the United States, like the Koch brothers, who are huge lobby groups that use their economic liberty to put in place Republican leaders that are pro-business. That's bad because they influence campaign outcomes undemocratically. We point you to Goldman Sachs and the Lehman brothers, big lobby groups in the United States that are capable of influencing foreign policy in places like Israel and forwarding Zionist notions that go on to harm the people in Palestine. These are political and legal powers your economic liberty subtly places in the hands of companies to perpetuate injustice. We say a just society must curtail those things. Now, final question. Who gets a better economy? I've got a cold, my bad. Now, let's talk about offshoring. Because if you want to get money back to the people, the best way is to stop companies from offshoring their money, which is a liberty that they can do. We think money doesn't go back to the people when it goes to Bahamian tax shelters, and we're happy to make that a crime. But two, when more money goes to the people, when you take money away from big corporations and put it in the hands of the people, you get much more spending power, and that's how more money gets put back into the economy in a much more direct way. We think when you empower poor people and reduce poverty, you're going to get a much better economy rather than support pro-businesses policies that leave the power in the hands of the rich. That's why we're happy to support harsher regulations that take away your economic liberty if it means helping the people. We only wanted to do two things. We wanted to reduce the ability of businesses to perpetuate poverty, and we wanted a more just society. In that respect, I don't know about you, but I'm sick of companies doing what they will with me. I'm happy to take their power away. Glad to propose.
Just. The proposition lives in a very idealistic world. We want to solve all the problems of the world. We want to take down big corporations. But what are they actually doing? Let's discuss. First point of rebuttal, on the idea of a principle versus a policy. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we are debating this motion in the context of a just society. We are debating the principle behind its argument. The opposition today has presented you the principle of fairness, whereas the proposition has given us a sort of shady principle and sort of skirted the rules and tried to just go to the policy. So we're not just going to discuss principle and policy, but we're not just going to discuss principle, we're going to discuss policy seeing as the proposition seems so keen on discussing it. But we do have to remember that the principle argument in any debate is key, especially in the context of a just society, because the principle argument comes first, and even then, with the principle, practicality will follow. Once we establish fairness in a society, then the practical nature of the rising floor will follow. But what have we talked about so far in today's debate? Second point of rebuttal, on the idea of an agent. And today the proposition has sort of flip-flopped on this idea of an agent. Because in the first speaker, when we gave them a POI, we asked them, what does the rich have a duty to do to help the poor? And they said, no. The rich doesn't have a duty to help the poor. What happened in the second speech? They talked about how corporations are these terrible entities who are exploiting the poor and therefore must pay the crimes. No, thank you, sir. But ladies and gentlemen, the rich and the corporations are intertwined. They have made a significant contradiction in flip-flopping this idea that the government is now the agent, but now the corporations are the agent. Ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear. The rich people are the agent. And as we have proved and has not been rebutted by the proposition, the rich do not necessarily have an inherent nature to help the poor out. No, thank you, ma'am. Because they do not have a legal obligation, or instead a moral obligation to help these other individuals. So they have this contradiction, and they also have this contradiction on this idea of the policy. And let's get into the third clash, therefore. They talk about this ideas of injustices. No, thank you, sir. Injustices relating to the principal argument that finally comes up in the second speaker and is not unaddressed by the first. But what are they really talking about here? They're talking about corporations exploiting their power through the justice system. Corporations exploiting their power through the political system. We're not talking about this here, ladies and gentlemen. We are talking about economic liberties. We are talking about the minimum wage. We are talking about taxation. We are not necessarily talking about the flaws in current judicial systems around the world that lead to corporations having this power. We are not, because as the first speaker has even elaborated upon, the policy about labor laws and welfare. These are the things we are talking about today, ladies and gentlemen. We are not necessarily talking about the justice system. We are not necessarily talking about laws. But even if we do discuss this idea, the proposition still falls, because we see that there are significant positions for the government to attack these corporations. We gave the example of JP Morgan, and the proposition simply rebutted this and saying, oh, it doesn't happen very often. No, thank you, sir. But these are problems of a judicial system, but under our paradigm, we would increase the floor, we would increase the principled argument of fairness. Now let's talk about what the proposition has talked about in a practical standpoint, about reducing poverty. Because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, we understand poverty is a significant problem, and which side can really solve this poverty is a really important ideal. But what has proposition said so far? They had talked about this idea that, companies are going to be offshoring, and pro-business policy has led to the exploitation of workers. We have already rebutted this on multiple fronts. We have shown you that in the developing world, sweatshops are actually beneficial for individuals because they can raise the floor for people who have no other alternative. Thank you, sir. But more importantly, on the idea of offshoring, since the second speaker of the proposition had so much to say about offshoring. Ladies and gentlemen, we are debating an even worse scenario. Because proposition presents this idea that offshoring is so bad in the current state, that corporations are moving away in the current state of taxation, that they're moving away to other countries. What about if we go further? What about if we go further on to proposition side, and the corporations see that, there are even more taxation on their side? Yes, sir.
Did you just say sweatshops are beneficial to individuals?
Thank you, sir.
Thus conceding that these conditions exist, and two, you support these deplorable exploitative conditions, don't you think?
Let's be real, ladies and gentlemen. In places like Singapore, when they were developing, in places like Taiwan, when they were developing, there were sweatshops. But what resulted out of that? Individuals were able to gain economic liberties. Individuals were able to raise the floor and get to the position that they are in today. They were able to get to the place where Taiwan and Singapore are amazing economies in the modern world. Indeed, there may be deplorable conditions and there may be faults of the judicial system. However, on an economic standpoint, using these workers and using workers for a lower wage is more important. But let's get back to this idea of offshoring, because the proposition seems key on diverting my attention. Because offshoring, ladies and gentlemen, if we operate under proposition policy, will make offshoring far, far worse. What is opposition going to be talking about today? Let's get into this idea. Because as my first substantive for the House today, we're going to be talking about growth, economic power, and reducing poverty. So the thesis of the substantive, which will talk about offshoring, is that in terms of individuals, businesses, and countries, this proposition policy will disincentivize. No, thank you, sir. So let's first talk about the business, because proposition seems so keen on talking about these individuals. Understand that under proposition policy, there is more regulation. There is more taxation. The United States currently is not enough, as they have said so far, so let's see what would happen in their policy. More taxation, more minimum wage laws. Companies will give up on the United States. Companies have in fact already given up, as I'll get into later, and they will leave. What will this cause? It will cause, they're taking their business elsewhere. They're even further hurting the poor in society. They're even further damaging the systems that they have created. The developing countries, furthermore, will need these corporations to grow. They need these corporations to institute change over the long term for the lower classes in society. Growth, ladies and gentlemen, is critical, and proposition does not allow for growth. But what about on an individual level? By redistributing this wealth and providing this welfare that the proposition should have been arguing solely from the beginning, thank you, sir, the poor are getting more rich. But what does this really mean? It means that individuals have an incentive to work for the bare minimum. They don't necessarily have to work as much because they're getting the same amount out of it. And if they do try to go for the next step, they're not going to be necessarily benefited as much. It means that individuals will not strive to reach the top, not strive to innovate, not try to do something new. And more importantly, you will institute individuals like welfare queens who are fine just lazing back on their couches, eating chips all day, and obtaining the money that they want. In Scandinavia, no, thank you, sir, the example brought up by the proposition themselves, there are individuals who would better off be using unemployment benefits than going into their low-skilled labor jobs. Ladies and gentlemen, there are examples of this in the real world. HSBC is advising individuals, companies, to get out of the United States because already, even though they haven't progressed to the system of the proposition, already they are too much. Individuals are moving and accepting that food stamps are good enough, and they call them Obama bucks, because they can just live off these Obama bucks and not necessarily work a day in their lives. Is this the fair system we want to live for? No, ladies and gentlemen. And now let's finally talk about the last step, substantive of the proposition, is that their side is a half step. And the thesis of this is that just focusing on delaying the problem never solves the root cause. Consider our ideal society. We are going to educate workers. We're going to increase institutions. We're going to let workers specialize and end poverty, the poverty cycle, through education. What is proposition doing? They're just giving money out. They're giving welfare. They're trying to solve the problem by just throwing money at it and simply saying like, oh, because they have more money, they will automatically get out of poverty. No, ladies and gentlemen. It perpetuates the cycle of poverty. It perpetuates these welfare queens generationally. And these farmers in Mississippi who don't necessarily want to work a day in their lives and can live without working a day in their lives. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the society that we want to live in. This is not the long-term dependence that poverty needs. This is not the long-term dependence that we want to have in our society, because this perpetuates poverty. So let's summarize. We want fairness in this society. We want the better option. We are proud to oppose.
Mic test. Okay. Is everyone ready? Ladies and gentlemen, wait, can everyone hear that? Just check. Okay, I'll begin now. Ladies and gentlemen, our society has three steps: ascendance, decadence, and as a result of that decadence, we fall into savagery. In today's society of faceless corporations backed by billionaires with deep pockets, we can see the decadence our society has fallen to, and we're telling you, if you continue to perpetuate this decadence, if you continue to harm the little guys and allow these faceless billionaires to raise to a pedestal of affluence on the backs of poor, suffering people, our society will fall into savagery. Now, let me tell you what I'm going to do in today's speech. First, I'm going to analyze the allegations and the accusations side opposition is levied against our case. Then I'll look at the minor points of the things, some of the more morally questionable things they've said. Then I'll look at the main contentions of the case, tell you why they've fallen. Finally, I'll look at the core concepts of this debate, tell you why we took those concepts and hence why we took this debate. Let's begin. First of all, no thank you. First of all, they accuse us of living in an ideal world, then say, well, let's debate on the principle. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason why we gave you policies in the first place is because we recognize that our principles and our ideas of justice and equality need to be done in a way that transitions to the practical world. And that's why we gave you all our policies, something that side opposition is not yet willing to engage us completely on. Finally, secondly, let's look at something else they've said. They say this: sweatshops are good. Now, I have several things to say about this. First, there's this innate contradiction because the first speaker never really told us why they were good, even though the second speaker claimed. He said that, in fact, he wished to dodge the idea of sweatshops by saying it falls outside the premise, no thank you, of this debate. Secondly, the second speaker kind of elaborated on it by saying that, yeah, they're beneficial. Ladies and gentlemen, the sweatshops are the main reason why we argue about this debate, because it allows companies to exploit these people who need jobs. It allows companies to force people, in order to feed their families, to work, to work in the most deplorable conditions. Ladies and gentlemen, to support such a thing is morally unforgivable. But then they'll go so far to say, as it actually helps our society. Ladies and gentlemen, there are sweatshops in China who've perpetuated harms towards Chinese civilians for generations. And I don't really see, no thank you, and I don't really see these companies who have this incentive to keep these people down in their poverty to help raise them out of it. Ladies and gentlemen, I find it disgusting that their case would support such conditions. Finally, they talk about it, no thank you, perhaps later. Finally, they say that we said that the rich have a duty to help the poor. We said no. In today's current society, they don't. But that's why we have introduced this policy, because they should. They should redistribute the help. They should help the kid on the south side of Boston who's too hungry to sleep, because even though his mother gave him all the food they can afford, they should have that duty. And the first speaker conceded that when he mentioned that they have a moral responsibility, even though they don't currently have a legal one. No, thank you. Finally, let's look at this. Let's look at the main points of their case. This idea of it's unmeritocratic, and they say that it doesn't promote competition. First, they back this up with this idea that typewriters don't deserve the pay a school superintendent does. That as a result, perhaps typewriters do deserve to go to bed hungry. The typewriters do deserve to not be able to feed the families to a full and wholesome degree. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something. I want to feed typewriters not because I recognize the use they have to me as a person in our society. No, thank you. I want to feed typewriters because I recognize it as fellow human beings. They deserve to eat. They deserve to have shelter. They deserve all these things, and that's something side opposition is not willing to give to them because they don't see the benefits, the full benefits they have to us as a society. Ladies and gentlemen, that's morally reprehensible. No, thank you. Then let's look at this further. They say that we raise the floor and we lower the ceiling. Ladies and gentlemen, even if this was true, and this is something that Nietzsche has elaborated on, that it's actually not true because we raise the ceiling through the economic benefits we give to them. But even if this was true, I'm happy to raise these people out of abject poverty. I'm happy to drag them out of the hole of poverty that they currently live in, even if it means, no thank you, the suffering of corporations who have deep pockets, because I recognize that these people's right to a just life, to an equal life, is more important. Second, they say this: the rich people don't have a legal responsibility, and through doing so, they concede that, and I quote the first speaker side of opposition, that sure, they might have a moral one, but that does not mean they have a legal one. And that's the exact thing we're fighting for, because we recognize that they do have this moral responsibility, and that's why we would implement policies to transcend this and transition this moral responsibility into a legal one. I'll take a point now. No? Okay. Or you can give me one later if you wish to. But they say that, well, the corporations will promote growth. And that first they premise this on one thing, that companies will leave countries if they don't see profits. Well, they can hardly leave the United States to seek profits elsewhere, since our policy will be global. We will help these companies in all societies in this world to treat their workers better, no thank you, to give them a living wage. And we believe that our current society is enough to sustain their profits and to continue this growth, that through treating their workers equally, we can create a society of true justice. Second, they talk about this, they talk about how corporations equal growth, and they've lacked engagement on the point of our offshore accounts, because we've shown you through tax avoidance, through examples like how Google's headquarters are on the Cameron Islands, that they are able to dodge taxes, to dodge the responsibilities they have to their people, to provide them wealth, to provide them shelter. They're able to dodge these things, and as a result, companies don't equal growth to the majority of the society because they don't even bother to funnel the money and profits they have into society in the first place. Yes?
Why is the proposition system global for creating one society? And if it is global, why isn't it come up earlier?
Ladies and gentlemen, because we assume that since this was, as you said, a principal judgment, this would be something that would transcend into a global scale. And we're talking about humanity as a whole. Why would we try to raise our society and poverty everywhere when if it was not a global standpoint? And we talked about this when Sonia mentioned about the fact that about sweatshops, and then she went on to mention things like about the abject poverty in Detroit, showing you the case in the developing world and the developed world. Second, they seem to argue against the idea of giving welfare in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, let that sink in. Because as I said before, there's a child on the south side of Boston who is too hungry to sleep. I want to help that child sleep, not because he gives me benefit as a society, but because he's a human being. Now let me tell you why we took this case and why we took the key principles of who provides the greatest benefits to our society as a whole. Because A, we told you that these economic liberties hurt the little guys. They empower the strong and the powerful to continue rising on the pedestal of affluence at the cost of these poor citizens. Second, we told you that through doing this, we create a more just society. We provide checks and balances, curtailing the overwhelming power these companies have over the smaller and defenseless people of our society. And thirdly, we told you that we do indeed raise the ceiling because we create a better economy. We allow these people to participate in the economy. We create further actors, and that's what we want. So ladies and gentlemen, I am happy to halt the decadence our society and these baseless corporations have slid into, to raise our people out of the poverty hole and provide a just, safer, and richer society. That's why I'm proud to propose. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, what side of proposition has been missing this entire debate is the entire notion of principle. They have based their arguments on these sort of major, they're trying to drown us in their sort of ideas of policy without ever showing us why this is inherent in their principle, and whereas our side has given you a clear linkage between our principle and why our policy would ensure that this principle remains practical in society. Now, they've argued this entire debate against a sort of straw man of trickle-down economics, which, let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, has not been the focus of our case whatsoever. What we have instead been focusing on is why we wish to bring this sort of equality of opportunity to society, and that why our policy is actually the best means of doing so. Now, neither have they shown us what their principle really is at a base level, and they've not really shown us what this means for their version of practicality. Meanwhile, we've shown you why allowing for government institutions such as better education, more prospects of jobs would actually lead to better equality of opportunity in society, allowing people to be rewarded for the work that for the rewards that they deserve. We don't want, ladies and gentlemen, a person that is lazy and does not that does not actually work hard to be given the same benefits as a person that works 13, 14 hours a day toiling, because this is not within our idea of a fair society. Now I'll be getting onto this idea more with the two major questions that have been raised in today's debate. The first really deals on the sort of proposition paradigm, which is which side can more effectively end poverty. And the second deals more with the paradigm that we've emphasized as being more important, as which side can ensure the more fair outcome. So in getting first to this idea on which side can more effectively end poverty, and like first I pointed that side proposition has been pushing in their second and third speakers for this sort of global policy, but we would like to say that first of all their own policy only really pushes and discusses these domestic labor laws and only domestic policies. But even so, we'd be arguing against the scope of No, thank you, sir. Now they've first of all been arguing against, since the first argument, against mergers, monopolies, and claiming that they perpetuate poverty, but we'd like to contest this on a few major grounds. First of all, we believe that this is not necessarily in the scope of the debate at all, which we've already brought forth to you, and that these are actually legal aspects and not necessarily economic liberties. But even so, we still say that oftentimes these monopolies and these sort of mergers can actually be beneficial for society. We see that monopolies can often allow for a free reign of sort of innovation and creativity, and even if, ladies and gentlemen, they may knock out smaller companies. What we're looking at today's motion is not companies. What we're looking at is people. And in our situation, we're looking at the net benefit for individuals in society, and we don't really mind if, for example, smaller companies get knocked out. And that's for a simple reason, ladies and gentlemen. When there is an effective monopoly in place, and it can provide jobs for people and can provide innovations and benefit society, like we've seen in their own examples of things like Google and Facebook, then we don't really mind. Because in the end, ladies and gentlemen, what we're looking at is the better outcome of quality of outcome in society. And if monopolies can provide this, no thank you, sir, then we support these monopolies wholeheartedly. If they are able to provide this. Now, they've also brought to us these idea of all the subtle injustices that are brought out by our side. And they told us that, and first of all, we'd like to say that, frankly, we need to be focusing on the major issues at this point in the debate, and these subtle injustices don't really play a major part. But even so, I'll contest these ideas and show you why, even on our side, we win on these ideas. Now, they brought to us the ideas that companies don't really need to control costs or wages. They already have this sort of huge control of the media and legal bounds. But we first of all would like to say that, first of all, this is extraneous to today's debate, in that we're arguing economic liberties. What we should be focusing on is sort of regulation and welfare policies that our side has been tackling and their side has been ignoring. But even so, we still say that things like control of the media are not really the sort of major influence that allows a company to make huge decisions over their operating costs in the way that they produce. So we really see that on our side. What we're looking at is a more realistic interpretation of what happens in society, how a company is actually able to ensure its own growth, and in doing so ensure the growth of an entire economy. Now let's move on to the more pertinent question in today's debate, which is which side can ensure a more fair outcome. And in doing so, I'd first like to focus on what the real principle that our side has brought forward today and why it is really important, and the fact that they brought forward was a sort of absence of principle whatsoever. They've asked us why we should, we brought us this idea of sort of this typewriter in Mississippi and that we should really be caring about it. But we'd like to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, why? It's easy to come with these sort of false impressions that with the ideas that everyone should be treated equally, that we should have this sort of equality of outcome that their side has been arguing for under ideas such as welfare, unemployment benefits, all these things. But we would like to ask you once again, why is this really important? What we have instead shown you is that what we want to do is reward effort. We want to give everyone sort of level playing field to start off with, and from there be able to benefit from the amount of work they put in. What we don't want, ladies and gentlemen, in a second, sir, what we don't want, ladies and gentlemen, is the person that decides to spend 3 hours a day pressing the button as an elevator as a job to be given the same benefits as someone that instead 13, 14 hours a day as a janitor in these situations. Yes, sir.
This is why, sir, the harm of mergers and acquisitions becomes important, because it rubbishes your idea of a level playing field when big companies get all the advantages to buy off smaller companies. How do you feel about the corporate feudalism that your side is supporting?
Thank you, sir. I'd like to again emphasize that even if we're looking at these cases where in every single industry in the entire, if we say, for example, Google and Facebook literally take over the entire economy, every sector, they're literally the sort of conglomerates that can control everything and anything, we still say that what we're looking at, even in these completely worst case scenarios, is still more benefits to the people, even though, let's say, their own wages may not be exactly proportional. What we're still seeing is an increase in job availability and increase in economic growth, which what we are saying is ultimately a better case in the long term for a country as a whole and for its people as a whole. Because ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, when we have the means to increase the institutions of job training, of education that come with these sort of increases in growth, we see this is ultimately a beneficial case for society. Now, it may seem sort of heartless to say that we are going to be doing things like ignoring the lazy, but what we would really like to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, is it really heartless to want the kid who works 14 hours a day in school through college and then in work to not be able to see the fruits of his labor, to not be able to, no thank you sir, be rewarded for all that he has worked for? And this is really the idea that we're debating under this premise of a fair outcome. So now to get on to the more pertinent question, which is which side can ensure a more fair outcome? And in proving today, ladies and gentlemen, why our side answers this question more conclusively, we will show you why we have won this debate. Our side opposition has instead spent the entire debate vilifying companies, but have never really drawn us a clear line of logic as to why these companies are inherently unjust, beyond just stating they are greedy. But let me instead show you why this fallacious leap in logic is completely overstated. We see that the most egregious crimes of companies are still punished by the law, and I'd like to remind you, ladies and gentlemen, in saying this, we are not really crossing the house, because the motion specifically says that we are arguing for something that is not significant, not that we are not arguing for nothing at all. However, even if this were not true, we still see that on the whole, profit-driven companies can and do provide value for society. Their own examples, things like Facebook and Google, they are economically driven to produce these goods, and we see that this has actually had an extremely good benefit to society. We don't really see that Google and Facebook are sort of exploitive monopolies that they seem to be trying to drive forward to us, but instead we see that they are providing a huge impact to society through the technology, through the innovation, and that is the sort of world that we would like to live in, where we see these beneficial companies, no thank you sir, providing value for society. And we see why is this exactly true, and that's because we see that companies in the society that we are arguing for are economically driven to produce, to provide the most value to society in the form of their goods at the least cost. Now, what has really been contentious in today's debate, this idea of sweatshops, and we'd say they brought to us the idea that we are actually forcing people to work in bad conditions, and it's ultimately an immoral thing to do. But we say that it's not a question of them having a job that is exploited, but it's a question of them having a job at all. In the majority of cases, ladies and gentlemen, sweatshops are not a place where you're going to break your back working there every day. And in this fringe cases that it is, we say that this is a trade-off we are willing to make to see development. They say that it's disgusting that we would use this, but we say that it's disgusting that they would try and use these emotional appeals to mislead you into thinking that sweatshops are inherently bad, when they are the only alternative, ladies and gentlemen, and they provide a long-term future to growth, like we've seen in South Korea, like we've seen in Singapore, and we say that this is extremely beneficial. Those bad working conditions might be now, they eventually allow for growth, and we see that this idea that sort of rising tide raises all boats, and what we end up doing is actually accomplishing the exact equality of opportunity we are seeking. We mitigate these harms by building up the institutions, the schools, the job training necessary to provide the sort of fairness that we wish to see in society, whereas their side simply fails to do so and try to allow for a blanket policy that does nothing but ultimately harm fairness and equality in society. Thank you.
I wish I lived in a world where there was no poverty. I wish I lived in a world where your work was recognized for what it was worth, and it was ideal. But let's see which side really achieves a world like that. Let's take a step back and consider a few questions on what has happened in today's debate, and really evaluate which side reaches that goal. So let's first talk about this idea of fairness. And as we have told you time and time again, the principle has sort of been left out of the proposition. But let's condense the ideas and boil it down to what's really gone on. It's become outcome versus opportunity. Equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. What is the proposition arguing for? They have argued for a lazy society. They have left the individual out. They have discussed corporation after corporation and said how corporations should be crippled because all corporations are bad. Do not be fooled by an absolute statement. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition today has told you about a chance to break free, about how fairness and hard work is rewarded, and how a man is in control of his own life. This is the fair society that we are looking towards. This is the principal argument that the opposition has been harping on so much today, and the proposition has failed to discuss. What has the proposition discussed? They've talked about effectiveness. And yet, at the same time, they still haven't clashed with us. Instead, strawmanning our argument, bringing up the idea that we're talking about trickle-down economics. No, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about equality of opportunity. So what has the proposition said as their counter policy? They have talked about mergers and acquisitions, and this has become a framework for their strongest point throughout the debate. But we have told you, first off, it is out of the scope, because this is a legal term, and not an economic liberty. But more importantly, we have shown you how mergers and acquisitions can still help the people. And that furthermore, it is even worse to go along their side than to look at ours, because the comparisons have been left off by the proposition. And yet we see that although we've contested on this idea of effectiveness, proposition has essentially dropped 3/4 of our entire case. 3 substantives, ladies and gentlemen. First off, on this idea of meritocracy, how that hard work shall be rewarded. They have dropped it. Second off, on this idea that the rich have no necessarily duty to the poor. They have merely one-liner rebutted it in saying that the poor are in a bad position. And finally, they have not rebutted the idea that this solution is a half step. What have they talked about, ladies and gentlemen? They have failed to compare. They've used empty rhetoric to make us feel sad. But ladies and gentlemen, they have tried to make us feel connected with these individuals. And yes, it is sad. We are trying to solve the problem. But just because it is sad doesn't necessarily mean doing something is doing the right thing. Doing something in this case, doing what proposition is saying in this case, is going to cause more problems and perpetuate this cycle of poverty. Perpetuate the very things that proposition has stood to try to avoid. What have we shown you? We have shown you that people can work. People have an internal control. People have control over their own lives. That hungry child in Boston that their third speaker is talking about will not exist because individuals can rise out of poverty. We have shown you through a more, better than, worse than, in a comparative context, that our side and our principles matter far more than anything that the proposition has given you today. Even if some of their points still stand, even if mergers and acquisitions are still in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, it is far more important to look at the opposition because we have shown you how more poverty lives in their world. More offshoring lives in their world. But what is more in our world? Fairness, equality of opportunity, a chance to look forward, a chance to live your life the way you want it. I told you that I wish to live in a world where there was no poverty. It sounds idealistic, it sounds insane even. But who really achieves it? Is it the proposition who takes us a step backwards, or is it the opposition who takes us at least in the right direction? Thank you.
Members of this august House, 2 questions I want to ask in reply. Which side is more principally just, and which side offers you the best outcomes? But before I go to do this, there are a couple of things this side has said that is abhorrent, and I'm not going to forgive them for. 1, sweatshops are good. On a first level, this is a concession that such deplorable conditions exist for workers, but on a second level, it is a defense of these conditions. You assumed that sweatshops will always translate into something better for the people, but offered us no analysis as to why that will happen, especially since how on our side, we have told you that there are generational sweatshops that currently exist in China, where the kids working there now have had grandfathers working in the same place as children. We have seen no change in that place, and you have given us no analysis as to why we can expect such change. And we think that's horrible, especially since we told you it's always going to be beneficial for big companies to keep sweatshops because that means cheaper labor. We got no response there. Secondly, he talked to you about welfare queens and began to flesh out a whole argument that sounded to me like an argument against welfare. Given that I'm a discriminated minority and a lot of my relatives are in welfare, I'm very hurt by this statement. We think welfare is important, and we don't like how you classify everybody on welfare as lazy welfare queens. You said that the Boston boy that is currently starving won't exist under your paradigm. Unfortunately for you, sir, right now as we speak, he does exist, and he is very hungry, and we think it's flippant that you will assume that he won't exist. Finally, you want to talk meritocracy and fairness. But this is a side that would give big companies with lots and lots of power even more power. Where is the fairness and where is the meritocracy? In fact, they sound like every conservative, gerrymandering, Tea Party Republican that I've ever met. Hey, Hugh, and that's horrible. Now, let's get to our first point. Where is the more principled justification? On our side of the house, we talked to you about harsher regulation. Our principle was stringent labor laws and stringent crackdown on companies that refuse to play to our socialist policy. Even if that might mean hurting profits, we were happy to make that concession if it could alleviate poverty and help a just society. Compare this with the opposition principle. Because in their first speech, they seemed to defend regulation. They said, yes, capitalism cannot be absolute, we must impose regulation. But then they go on to talk about liberties and freedoms that companies should enjoy because of fairness. But you have to understand, restricting companies is mutually exclusive to giving them liberties. You can't fight for regulation, but at the same time, ask for pro-business policies that essentially mean deregulation. You cannot have your cake and eat it too, even if our cake is delicious, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we think this is a sign that has serious principle inconsistencies, and you cannot forgive them for that. Finally, they want to talk about principles a lot. Principles are great, and we have that, but debates are about practical outcomes. And let me prove to you why we get more tangible outcomes here. The op assumes that corporations automatically equals growth, but no analysis as to why the money corporations make go back to the people, especially since we've extensively elaborated the loopholes of offshoring and mergers and acquisitions. Offshoring means money doesn't go back to the people, and mergers means creations of corporate feudalism that disproportionizes the playing field. This rubbishes their policy of meritocracy and fairness, and their only evolved rebuttal to these ideas was, hey, that's outside the scope of the debate. How convenient. If their only harm is corporations will leave the state, then I don't mind. Because these are the very same corporations that don't give money back to the people, but even if they did it over the backs of these people, over exploitation, and over things that very well should be regulated. And on our side, we ban offshoring with harsh crimes. We put corporate leaders in jail for sweatshops. We want a just society. Contrary to popular belief, I'm not a Marxist, I'm not a communist, but I care for the people. You said you wanted to live in the world that we proposed. You wish that you lived in that world. I wish I lived in that world too. Let's make that world happen. I'm so happy to propose.